Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org. Edina Eye Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years now in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, Edina Eye offers comprehensive services and dedicated specialists committed to excellence with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
It's a pleasure to be here again with my friend Steve Hunegs. My name is Richard Logan. I'm a retired professor of human development, which is one of the fields in the social sciences. And of course, Steve Hunegs has been the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council for Minnesota and the Dakotas for quite a few years. Steve, you're one of my favorite people to talk to. Of course, I don't talk to that many people anymore, but you're one of my favorite people to talk to. And you know, the last time you and I were here, you had brought up this concept of voluntary associations that Alexis de Tocqueville had written about back in the 1800s. I read the book. I think it was after the 1800s that I actually read that book. But anyway, you talked about voluntary associations, which are critical to civil society. And one of the challenges we face nowadays is that there's so much political division that I think you could say there's a lot of uncivil things happening in society. In fact, that might be too polite a term for some of the things that are happening with, say, the rise of anti-Semitism and so on. But anyway, I've really been looking forward to getting back to talking with you again, because you deal, first of all, you live and breathe civil society by virtue of the voluntary association you head and all of the relationships you try to foster with people across the political world. But I wonder if you wanted to say some things to start us off about some of the issues we face today and how the JCRC and you go about trying to be a healing force.
Thank you for having me on the show, Richard. The last time we connected was virtually, and it's a great pleasure to be in person, right?
It is, indeed. It is.
And to be with our dear friends. As we know, 20th anniversary of Access to Democracy,
yes.
Right? Toast to Alan Miller and Sharon Miller, who have done so much to promote civility and goodwill.
Exactly.
Through discussions with elected officials, public officials, asking the right questions, asking difficult questions. That, after all, is the essence of democracy. So congratulations to them, and thank you,
A
Richard.
Civil argument rather than a nasty argument. Yes.
Precisely the case. And again, thank you for having me on the show, Richard. I got 2 thoughts from the Bible. One is the Talmud, which is the commentary on the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. It says, it's not your job to perfect the world, but you can't desist from the effort. And I think that's sort of the amalgamation that we're always trying to strive. And I think sometimes people believe they enter the public fray or the public square, and it's up to them to perfect things, make everything right. Well, no one can do that. But you have to be willing to participate too. That's really important. And then there's also, from the Torah, it says, it's your duty to associate with the community, right? And there's different ways that people associate with the community, but oftentimes it's through volunteerism, helping other people, things along those lines, right? And yeah, I'm very proud JCRC, Jewish Community Relationships, Jewish Community Relations Council, Minnesota, Dakotas, after all these years, founded in 1939, that it's always been a goal of ours to model civility, right? Sometimes we have vast differences with people, but I'm here to tell you this, Richard, too, and I'll affirm this in front of your television audience here. We have 225,000 square miles of paradise. That's what I like to say, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And far more often, our work is characterized by friendship, partnership, collaboration. Go on chapter and verse to cite all sorts of examples, which is not to say we don't have some difficult issues before us right now, particularly in the realm of violence from both the left and the right, sometimes leaving the Jewish community in a pincer. But I will emphasize the positive of the work that we do, and that's because even for all of our difficulties in this country, we have that well-developed sense of civil culture in the United States. And going back to Alexis de Tocqueville, writing in the 1830s, he was recognizing what he thought was the American genius, the American capacity for organizing themselves in a way that wasn't connected to the government, right? And we've always had that great blessing in this country.
No, that is quite a legacy, and really, de Tocqueville's work is one of my, as a social scientist, it's one of my favorite works. And there is a legacy. We do have a legacy. I mean, there were bitter arguments among the founders at times, and yet we also have this legacy, and a lot of it has lived, as you just intimated, not in the government sector, but in the public sector among citizens. Of course, a key factor here is that people have to think of themselves as public citizens and not just private individuals. I would argue, in fact, I wrote about this as an academic going back some years, that the real God for too many Americans these days is the self, and not a supernatural, not God as we know in the Torah or God as we know in the Christian Bible. And so I think we suffer from people use the word siloed and so on. And so I would argue that there has been a decline in people's sense of themselves as public citizens and an increase in people's sense of themselves as more private individuals. But that's something about which people could have a civil debate as well, right? And I'm really glad to hear you talk about the positive things, and you engage with people who do think of themselves as public citizens. I have to add, too, that one of the things that attracted me to Judaism many decades ago now was the fact that the average Jewish person, in my experience, is very likely to think of him or herself as a public citizen who has a moral obligation, as you were just saying, to engage in the public sphere. And so I wonder if you could speak to that theme a bit more.
You broached so many
interesting
interesting and complicated comments.
I'm sorry. I can do that.
Just a note on a historical record. Up until the Enlightenment, that is the spreading of knowledge.
Yes.
Within the Jewish world, well, first with the greater community and with the Haskalah, which is sort of the
Jewish Enlightenment.
Yep. And let's talk about European life right now, as opposed to Jewish life outside of Europe from 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, in communities that were very insular, right, for self-protection reasons and because that was maybe the nature of civilization in those days. Of course, the Haskalah brought the opportunity to dwell amongst others, in a way, dwell amongst strangers, right? Communicate with them, participate in their life slowly but surely, uneven as it was. Napoleon said the following. He said, "The Jews as individuals, everything. The Jews as a nation, nothing." Right? I mean, sort of the idea was the Jew as the individual, the Jew stepping outside of its history and engaging with the greater world. And this was a relatively new phenomenon.
Yes.
19th century, so 250 odd years ago. But to your point, and again, I'm not a historian of Jewish history by any stretch, especially in the Western countries, Jews relished the opportunity, to engage with the rest of the world as they had done, previous to the fall of the temple, the destruction of the temple, right, when the Jews had their own independent existence in the Holy Land. So it was sort of a flowering of Jewish culture, Jewish times, etc. And we could talk about this as the stuff of which graduate schools are made, but you raise this issue, and it is fascinating to see how Judaism confronted modernity.
Right.
Right.
But they
or the Jewish people.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I would have the impression that part of this move into modernity, and there was this figure, Mendelssohn,
sure.
who was considered one of the first modern Jew. I mean, remained sort of Orthodox, but also engaged in the modern world. But this move into the modern world, Jews had the advantage, if you want to put it that way, of a legacy of scholarship, of inquiry, and in fact of debate. I've argued that Jews were in some ways uniquely pre-adapted for the institution of democracy because they had this legacy of debate, in the writing of the Talmud and so on, and a lot of Torah scholarship involved a lot of debate and so on. Yeah.
Chavruta, that is two people studying Talmud together and having the discussion. And I'm no philosopher. I think I got a D in my philosophy class at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But I remember Hegel and the idea of sort of the combination of what comes when different views sort of mix, and perhaps the ultimate truth that arises when different views are exposed to each other. Right. And again, I should never discuss philosophy, that's for sure. But I think there's, to your point, there's sort of a spark of genius, and it's just not amongst Jews too. There's so much of the advancement over, from the Renaissance going forward involved the engagement of peoples from throughout the world. I mean, wasn't that sort of the grand story of Marco Polo?
And the interaction.
East meeting West along the Silk Road in Asia, right? And it sort of goes to a greater point, and that is we see forces throughout the world these days concerned about topics like immigration. And, there are critical issues of sovereignty, don't get me wrong, but the ability of peoples to interact with each other, engage each other, is actually fundamentally important to human development. You know that probably better than anybody else, given that's the
I don't know about that.
The field in which you've worked over time, right?
But the otherization of people, I mean, modernity, one of the founding assumptions with modernity was, as you were just saying, that we will engage with people who have different views from ourselves. Nowadays, I'm afraid that there are too many people who fear dislocation from the world as they know it. Say maybe some of the most conservative evangelical Christians who have been able to presume that this is fundamentally a Christian nation that we live in, and yet diversity and immigration and so on can threaten this. But I want to raise another fascinating point. One of the people I find most interesting in history is Spinoza. And Spinoza not only participated into that move into the modern world, he helped craft the modern world through his philosophy. That's a powerfully important thing, because he was one of the great founders of the idea that the ordinary person has a brain. The ordinary person can participate in governance, and so and he helped rethink in major ways. I mean, before the Enlightenment, it was only the Pope and the monarchs and the nobility who had brains, according to the so-called conventional understanding of things. The Pope was the emperor of Europe.
Spinoza, interesting.
Go ahead.
Was an agnostic, right?
Yes.
Was an agnostic.
Well, he believed he saw God in nature.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah.
100% correct. Thank you.
No.
Point being, you talk about Jews. Mordechai Kaplan, who was professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the sort of the seedbed of the conservative movement of Judaism, he saw Judaism and Jewish life as civilization. So there's a strand of religion, but this whole idea of people who strongly associate with the Jewish community who may have no belief in God. Right? They have a belief in Jewish history and Jewish civilization, Jewish values, etc., but they may have no belief in God for that matter. And that's part of the Jewish genius, if one wants to say that, is this idea, and I've always been a subscriber to it, of Judaism as civilization, right? Art, culture, ethics, history, you name it.
Intellectual history.
Intellectual history,
Yeah.
the way people live.
Yep.
And not to be cabined in any one form or another. Judaism can take on many expressions, and people's belief in Judaism or people's belief in the nationhood and destiny of the Jewish people can take on many dimensions. We always hope in that way of looking at the world that is one that fully engages with the modern world and peoples of all background. That's why I have a wonderful job, if I say so myself.
Yeah, no.
As I have the opportunity to travel, to see people, work with them, debate with them, help them, they help us, right? And that, I think if you could bring de Tocqueville back to 2021 with all of our difficulties, he would say, I'm thankful that there's still a good, strong, civil society in this country that I loved so much as a Frenchman when I was touring it, right back in the 1830s.
And there are a great many organizations and institutions that really live in civil society, even if we don't talk about it in that language so much. They're the League of Women Voters. I mean, you can go to the ACLU. You can go on and on and on with a great many. I happen to be on our neighborhood council, which is kind of a quasi-governmental feature, but it's really a group of volunteers, and we try to work on behalf of our community. We try to be citizens within our community. We're really, I would argue, more in civil society than we are in anything governmental, even though the government of the city of Minneapolis is obligated to listen to us, and they provide funding. But no, I think the intersection between the legacy of, say, the founders, and they recognize the importance of civil society, and the legacy of the Jewish people who have, thought of themselves as public citizens, feel that they have a moral obligation to participate in the community, who have a history of debating, which is foundation. Democracy is what? It's an argument among different points of view. Hopefully, it should be a civil argument rather than an ugly one. So I think that's fascinating. And I know that you brought some other things here. So right now you can either say more on what in response to what I just said, or you could bring up something else that you've been engaged in recently, because that's interesting and important too.
Well, democracy is a spirit, right?
Yep.
It's spirits that act. It's what you're doing, helping the neighborhood out, welcoming people to the neighborhood, keeping an eye on things. Security is important too. You can't have democracy without security too.
That's true.
You've got to keep that in mind. Really important, right?
And that is why one of the things that I find most admirable about your work is the outsized efforts you put into security for the Jewish community, but you don't limit it just to the Jews. You have done a lot of work with the Somali community and helping them and so on. So,
you know, this incident that occurred with the Hmong Cultural Center on University Avenue, 2 days after it posted its sign, it was defaced, vandalized in an ugly manner, right? And immediately we spoke out for it, reached out to them, find ways we can work together in a security way. And the Star Tribune was kind enough to sort of editorialize about the importance of the communitarian element of security, citing our work, but it could have cited any number of organizations in town, because many of us believe that. Something that's on my heart that I'd like to talk to you about, Richard, and I brought it along today, is this piece called the Duluth Lynchings. We had the 100th anniversary of the lynchings of Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, Isaac McGee.
in Duluth.
In Duluth,
Yeah.
right? Absolutely heinous, murderous example of racial terrorism in the United States, and it occurred in our state. And I'm proud to say that the Chief Judge of the Federal District of Minnesota, Jack Thunheim, organized a committee. It's sort of a tradition of outreach of the federal court, in which we had opportunities to program, think about, write about. COVID unfortunately interfered with some of the activities of it, but we were able, at the end of the day, one of the things we were able to do was organize, have memorialized with essays and welcomings and greetings from the governor, from the attorney general, from experts on the issue of what happened to the lynchings. And thanks to the Minnesota Historical Society, Josh Leventhal, Kent Wentworth, etc., put together. They really did a wonderful job with this, and sort of became the JCRC's piece within what they call the CLCC, the Collaborative Legal Community Committee, to sort of bring this to life. Really, it was the MHS that did most of the heavy laboring. But I'm very proud of it, and I commend it to people to read, because you can sit down and take a few hours and sit back and think about this remarkable abdication of responsibility and destruction of the due process of law that occurred in Minnesota, ending up in the murder of 3 African Americans in 1920. It's important for us. We talk about absent narratives, right? This is a critically important absent narrative. There's a memorial in Duluth, and it's a remarkable, amongst other things, teaching opportunity, because we have to be able to reflect, I think, in civil society, as you say, Richard, the reflection, the ability to contemplate our terrible errors is something that's critically important within, by the way, I don't want people to ever misunderstand me. There's a lot of glories to this country, tremendous glories. There's also been tremendous issues and injustices, and we have to address them both. We have to appreciate what we have, and we also have to appreciate the need to address our mistakes of the past.
Right, and to learn from them that if we would make the effort, as the JCRC does over and over again, to reach out to people who have differing views on things, maybe we could prevent these kinds of this kind of otherization of people, otherization with a capital O, where the primary understanding or perception of somebody else is that they are so radically different from the way I am. And the whole idea of democracy was to, again, democracy is an argument between people who have different values, different beliefs, different points of views, different understanding of the world, but in a setting where you can debate civilly. I mean, democracy is often defined, I think, very, very rightly, as an argument. It really is an argument, but it doesn't have to become an argument that leads to violence and the desire to destroy somebody who's different from yourself.
A couple quick points. One, Salo Baron, who was the first chair of Jewish history, religion in the secular setting at Columbia University, he also said, avoid the temptation of the lachrymose view of Jewish history, kind of a fancy word for don't fall into the trap that somehow all of Jewish history is a succession of pogroms, massacres, culminating in the Holocaust. I mean, that's, yes, a feature and something that's sad and that we should address. Nevertheless, going back to this idea of Jewish civilization or Judaism as civilization, there's, of course, so much more, right? And we need to do that about our own country, too. Don't fall into the lachrymose view of American history, too. A great example, I brought this along, is there was the Kinder Transport, this effort to save about 10,000 German and Austrian children. Myself, Rabbi Alexander Davis of Bethel Synagogue, and Bruce Karstad of the American Swedish Institute, which hosted the exhibit. We had over 8,000 people that came and saw the exhibit. Just the amount of learning that went on, and that's a classic example. The Swedes, the Jews here in Bethel Synagogue, all combining for this project. But talk about something else. I told you I was bringing Show and Tell today.
Okay.
This has rapidly become one of my favorite books, From the Gridiron to the Battlefield by Danny Spivak, who's a KARE 11 reporter. His grandpa played on the 1941 freshman team. Gopher National Championship team 8-0 as they were in 1942, 41, but 41, of course, the coming of the war. And he does this beautiful job of wrapping together the events that were occurring in the fall of 1941, right, the sinking of the Greer, etc., and the huge debate over isolationism and interventionism with what was happening in the football field, because how do they all tie together? Well, many of the members of the 1941 Minnesota Gopher football team end up in World War II, right? And the story is almost seamless in the way that he tells us. But to your point about democracy, talk about a raging debate, isolationism versus interventionism, 1939, 1940, 1941. And of course, not everybody fell into those two camps. It was not one or the other necessarily, but Lend-Lease, the bases, exchange, trading of destroyers to Britain, all of that sparked great debate. And one of the people in the heart of it, as you know, and I'm just fascinated to learn that you've done your own independent research, is about Charles Lindbergh.
Yeah.
Because Lindbergh, how do you look at Lindbergh? Well, on one hand, he single-handedly changed the nature or the trajectory of international aviation by becoming the first solo flight from New York to Paris in 1927. Changed life forever.
Right.
On the other hand, there he was as the sort of the spiritual leader of America first, descending into anti-Semitism.
Yep.
Many of the comments talking about Jewish control of the press, etc. You know, these ancient old conspiracy theories about Jews.
Yep.
September 11, 1941, he goes on national radio and makes this awful speech about the Jewish control of the press in Hollywood leading the United States into war, right? So you get all this in this book, and the debate that raged in the United States between Lindberghs and people who were short of Lindbergh and people who were interventionists, and much of this played out against Minnesota, which was both a home of strong interventionism amongst particularly our mercantile class, which was very British-oriented,
Yes.
and sort of traditional isolationism in the areas of greater Minnesota. And the point is, A, you can learn about it, and B, the debate, which, by the way, was not always civil, as we were talking about isolation. This is nothing new in American life.
It is nothing new.
About vicious, tough, sometimes slanderous, libelous conduct in the debate of affairs, right?
And yet, there are many organizations and institutions that do live out every day that affirmative legacy that democracy is a civil argument among people with their, and you know, in the beginning we otherized the Irish, we otherized the Poles, and so we otherized Mediterranean people and so on, and many others. But over time they became incorporated into what we hope is the civil, continuing civil debate. And I have to say that there are Jewish organizations that I like to use the term punch above their weight. The Jewish Community Action, I think, is an example of a small Jewish group that punches above its weight.
Sure.
JCRC punches above its weight. Why is that? I would argue it's because Jewish people are more likely than the average Joe, possibly, to think of themselves as public citizens who do have this moral obligation to engage in the community. And so the groups that are doing that are continuing, again, whether we use the term civil society or not, we are building civil society, and we are civil society, whether it's local in a neighborhood or whether it's nationally with one of the national Jewish organizations, or indeed other kinds of national organizations. Yeah. So that legacy outside of government is a very precious legacy, and de Tocqueville was absolutely right.
You know, spin it forward from de Tocqueville, one generation, Civil War. Why do we have Thanksgiving? Because Lincoln wanted us to remember the war dead, and those who last full measure, his Gettysburg Address, right?
Right.
And we got that coming up around the corner, and you know, you talk about what people are willing to do in defense of democracy,
right,
and the Constitution. Got Thanksgiving coming up, and the original purpose of Thanksgiving is to remember those who gave their lives on the battlefield.
On that moving note, thank you ever so much, Steve.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, indeed.